rejected the rabbi's inclusion of fowl under the biblical prohibition on eating meat and dairy together. As a consequence, Karaites and Rabbinites would not, at least in theory, have regarded one another's homes as kosher. And because Karaites rejected significant elements of the rabbinite prayer service, they formed synagogues of their own where they followed a distinctive liturgy made up almost exclusively of biblical passages. Karaite observance of the Sabbath and festivals also differed markedly from that of Rabbinites. Whereas Rabbinites permitted the use of fire kindled before the Sabbath for light, warming up food, etc., Karaites, at least initially, adopted a much more stringent position according to which the use of fire, regardless of when it was kindled, was completely forbidden. Again, one could easily imagine the sociological impact of such differences on the two groups, since they would have essentially precluded a Karaite from visiting the home of a Rabbinite on the day of rest. Karaites also prohibited sexual intercourse on the Sabbath. Before the discovery of the Geniza, our understanding of the relations between the two groups was mediated by our knowledge, on the one hand, of ritual differences such as these, and on the other hand, by a body of ferociously hostile polemical literature exchanged by writers in both camps. The resulting picture was one of mutually felt antagonism and almost complete social segregation. The Geniza's discovery has dramatically revised this overly neat picture of social isolation resulting from theological disagreement. The more we learn about the social and economic aspects of life for medieval Jews, the more we realize how inseparably connected the two communities in fact were. The Geniza provides us with abundant evidence that joint business ventures involving Karaites and Rabbinites were commonplace. Even more impressively, we learn that Karaites were generous donors to Rabbinite religious institutions, the very embodiment of the traditions they ostensibly reviled. But the most remarkable illustration of the more accommodationist attitude that evidently prevailed on the ground is the corpus of marriage contracts for weddings between Karite and Rabbinite partners, essentially ketubot for mixed marriages. And that is what you're looking at one example of this right now. Geniza records indicate that mixed marriages of this sort were actually quite common before the 13th century and were formally recognized in both communities. The Geniza has even preserved a page from a formulary with a heading that reads, "This is the form for a marriage in which the groom is a Rabbinite and the bride a Karaite." A special heading was warranted because contracts that were used for such unions contained a unique set of clauses designed to guarantee mutual tolerance, each party undertaking to respect the religious traditions of the other. We find, for example, the stipulation that a Rabbinite husband will not bring into his house, quote, "the fatty tail, the kidneys, or the lobe of the liver," all of which were prohibited to Karaites but permitted to Rabbinites. Other stipulations concern the observance of the Sabbath and festivals. The Rabbinite husband promises that, quote, "he will not light candles on the Sabbath evening and that there will be no fire at all in his house on the Sabbath day." He also concedes that, quote, "he will not make love to her on the Sabbath and festivals as if they were weekdays." For her part, the Karaite bride promises to observe the festivals with her husband, a pledge that presumably obliged her to occasionally celebrate holidays twice, once on their Rabbinite date and once on their Karaite date, and to observe holidays like Hanukkah that were not part of the Karaites' religious calendar at all. The ketubah, or marriage contract, that we're looking at right now is an especially interesting example of this phenomenon. This is the marriage contract of David ben Daniel and Nasia, the daughter of Moshe HaKohen, and as you can see, it's dated 1082. The groom was a Rabbinite and the bride a Karaite, and we also have examples where the affiliations are the other way around. Two things made this particular case so important. The groom's father had been the head of the Rabbinite Academy in Jerusalem, and the groom himself went on to serve as the leader of the Rabbinite community in Egypt. So we are not dealing with a religiously suspect or marginal figure here, but rather someone at the very center of Rabbinite society. David ben Daniel's marriage to Nasia thus exemplifies how porous the divide between Karaites and Rabbinites in reality was, and offers an invaluable corrective to earlier, overly schematic understandings of the way the two communities interacted or didn't. My next example illustrates how the relatively free marketplace could facilitate not only business cooperation and fraternity among members of different religious traditions, but could even lead to romance. What we're looking at here is the draft of a deposition that was submitted to a Muslim judge. The case involved an inappropriate relationship that allegedly occurred between a Jewish girl and a Christian man. The testimony is that of a Jewish physician who had first-hand knowledge of the two parties involved. We learned from the deposition that he worked together with a Christian doctor in an apothecary, and he describes for us how people would come in and get their prescriptions written up, etc. Our witness reports that among the people visiting the shop was a young woman whom he initially took to be a Muslim, but later learned was Jewish. He noticed that her visits became quite frequent. This went on for over a month. Things became more serious, however, when she showed up one day, and after sitting with the Christian doctor for a good bit of time, invited him to ride with her to see a patient who lived far away. The doctor agreed, and after he finished his work, the two disappeared together. Unfortunately for them, although fortunately for us, they were followed by two Muslim hat makers who spied their amorous behavior and reported them to the authorities, which is why the matter ultimately required the deposition of our Jewish physician and resulted in the episode's documentation. Here, then, we have evidence that the Muslim authorities were indeed interested in limiting relationships between members of different non-Muslim communities. But at the very same time, we are afforded a precious glimpse of the love-struck who evidently persevered in conducting such illicit love affairs nonetheless. Conversion to and from Judaism was yet another realm in which different religious communities were brought into direct contact. And here too, the Geniza has supplied extensive and detailed information. The most famous conversion story is that of Johannes of Oppido, the son of an aristocratic Norman family in southern Italy who was born in the late 11th century. While his twin brother Roger went off to become a knight, Johannes was chosen to enter the priesthood. The young Johannes, however, evidently had religious doubts. When he began to study the Hebrew Bible, he was impressed by the way its traditions seemed to be preserved in Jewish practice. He circumcised himself and began to observe Jewish customs. When he learned that Andreas, the Archbishop of Bari, had moved to Egypt and there converted to Judaism, he took it as a sign that he should pursue a similar path. Johannes moved to Constantinople, where he began studying Judaism more intensively and writing pamphlets challenging Christian beliefs. He converted to Judaism in 1102, and from that point on was known as Ovadia. Traveling from Constantinople to Baghdad, Aleppo, and Tyre, before ultimately settling in Cairo, his spiritual quest brought him into direct contact with the most vital centers of Jewish culture in the East and some of its most influential leaders. We know so much about Johannes Ovadia because he wrote a fascinating autobiography detailing his life's journey. But the twin transitions from Christianity to Judaism and from Western Christendom to the Islamic East, represented by his life, are perhaps even more poignantly captured in the page you see before you. What you're looking at is the text of a Hebrew liturgical poem to which Ovadia has supplied musical notation marks. Such notation is exceptionally rare in a medieval Jewish text. In fact, this is the very earliest transcription we have of synagogue music. But what makes this text even more interesting, I think, is its hybrid nature. While the text is Jewish and of Eastern provenance, the notation marks and melody come straight out of the Gregorian chant tradition. In other words, even as he embraced a new religious identity in a new part of the world, Ovadia evidently maintained something of his earlier monastic life in Italy. What we are looking at then, in a sense, is a manifestation of the way proselytes could, in at least certain cases, function as cultural and religious mediators, facilitating the transmission of traditions and ideas across communal boundaries. Different communities also came into contact with one another's traditions at shared religious shrines, which often lay on the periphery of the more organized and carefully monitored urban settings of communal life. The famous medieval traveler Benjamin of Tudela, who wandered across the Near East in the last third of the 12th century, describes a number of pilgrimage sites in Islamic lands that were venerated by Jews, Muslims, and Christians, the most famous of these being the tomb of the biblical prophet Ezekiel in Iraq. From the Geniza, we learn about another such site located at Damu, a site on the west bank of the Nile, several miles southwest of Cairo. There, Jews maintained a shrine which they identified with the biblical Moses. While the shrine could be visited at all times of the year, there were two main pilgrimage occasions: the 7th of the Jewish month of Adar, the traditional date of Moses' birth, and the festival of Pentecost, or Shavuot, which falls in the late spring. While most of the rituals that would have been observed as part of the pilgrimage are not described in our sources, an ordinance issued by leaders of the Jewish community of Fustat at the beginning of the 11th century provides us with a rare window onto at least some of the things that took place at Damu. And this is what you are looking at now, this edict or ordinance. The ordinance was drafted in response to the perceived breakdown of religious and social norms at the pilgrimage site. As one scholar has put it, the ordinance sought to control dangerous, unregulated space. In its provisions, we have a fascinating mirror image of the bacchanalian atmosphere that prevailed at Damu. The ordinance tries to impose decorum, banning frivolity and various forms of entertainment, including gambling and chess. It also bans marionette shows, singing and dancing, and brewing beer at the shrine. The sexes are no longer to mingle either. The edict forbids men to socialize with women, sit near them, or even look at them. Especially noteworthy is a clause that seems to suggest the awareness of homosexual encounters at the pilgrimage site as well. But it is a clause that specifically forbids the Jewish pilgrim from bringing a Gentile or an apostate with him to the sanctuary that interests us at the present. For here again, we can see the way religious authorities sought to erect firm boundaries between communities, while at the same time recognizing a social reality that routinely rendered those efforts ineffective. My final example of communal interactions relates to a highly creative Jewish mystical movement in 13th and 14th century Egypt. These Jewish mystics called themselves Hasidim, no connection whatsoever to the modern movement that originated in Eastern Europe. And in calling themselves Hasidim, they revived an old biblical term. But we shouldn't let the biblical roots of their self-designation mislead us, for their mystical traditions were heavily indebted to the teachings of the Islamic Sufi tradition. These Jewish Sufis were avid readers of the classic works of Islamic Sufism. Pages from the works of Al-Khalaj, Ibn al-Arif, Al-Ghazali, and Suhrawardi were found among the Geniza manuscripts. They also produced original Sufi-inspired texts of their own. Unique devotional practices played an important role in their religious program. They wore special woolen tunics and emphasized the importance of nightly vigils, daily fasting, meditation in solitude, and abstention from sex. The Pietists also tried to introduce a number of innovations into the synagogue service, including ablutions of hands and feet before prayer, frequent prostrations on the ground, and sitting on the floor in rigidly straight rows. As some of you may have realized, this sounds an awful lot like prayer in a mosque. But by no means was this a movement on the fringes of Jewish society. During the 13th century, one of its leading proponents was Abraham Maimonides, the son of Moses Maimonides and the administrative head of Egypt's Jewish community.